Kaimere is a distant planet. It is defined by waves of life brought from Earth and set free to evolve independently in this new context. The indigenous life of the planet, swarms of microbes called magic by the people who live there, are what harvest Earth organisms and make copies on Kaimere. As the asteroid which concluded the Mesozoic never struck Kaimere, dinosaurs remain the dominant terrestrial megafauna. A drive to understand magic is at the heart of the Assembly. While witches and other enchanted beings have magic of their own, and magic bound to a host is only known form of magic on Earth, it doesn't take long on Kaimere to find wild magic everywhere. Magic could be found in the soil, in the water, in the air. Some form independent swarms, others dancing between hosts, and a few that make their own bodies of slime. Magic grew like mold or moss on rocks and trees. It is usually invisible to the naked eye, only visible under microscopes they brought from Earth or similar devices independently developed at the Great Library of Bolundakoi, which is how Chimerans learned of magic. A lot of this wild magic has since been found on Earth, likely carried through the opening and closing of the portal, but without a host, magic generally does not live well on Earth. The current theory is that a few minor differences in atmospheric composition between the planets may be quite important to magic, but it is not presently understood to a consensus what agent drives this success in Kaimere or trend of struggle on Earth. Shortly after Linnaeus' text on the systems of nature was published in the 1750s, the Assembly began classifying magic along with Chimeran flora and fauna. Margaret Thackeray, who had conducted a substantial study of botany in her teens back in England, spent much of her later life laying the groundwork for taxonomy in Kaimere. While the Great Library provided a lot of starting reference, fieldwork to collect first-hand specimens was the inception of the first fieldwork in Kaimere. This began with collecting samples of magic, then plants, and finally animals. Each field mission required the unanimous consent of delegates from each nation in Kaimere. Fear of human-spread diseases meant missions to urban areas almost never got approval. Therefore, culture studies, history and flora and fauna in populated areas were almost entirely reliant on second-hand information from the Great Library. Missions beyond the known world, however, were much easier to get approval for. Because of this, a lot of Assembly knowledge is actually more confident in these areas beyond the known world. Another source of information was for Assembly members who were taken on as guests of Chimerans. This was a sort of gray area for the Assembly. It didn't violate the Amsen Accords, which regulated their study, but they couldn't act in formal capacity as members of the Assembly, just guests of the Chimeran nobles who took them in, and all at the approval of their overseers. A consequence of this is that a lot of the early information in the known world was gathered by private citizens unbound by the rigors of verification and review. As such, misinformation was rampant in these first few decades of Assembly presence in Kaimere. Perhaps no man is more responsible for this than Gustav Dupont. Gustav was the son of a French merchant and sorcerer. Gustav had no magic himself, as his mother was mundane, but he was a talented musician, dancer, artist, and poet, and brought considerable wealth to the Assembly. He was the first human to travel the known world from 1735 to 1741, and his stories would serve as the foundation of Assembly understanding of the peoples of the known world, especially prior to Thomas Hartsfield and the historian Matthew Darcy's journey to the Great Library in 1747 and subsequent publication in 1752, which didn't get nearly as much attention because of Darcy's famously dry academic prose. Unfortunately, much of what Dupont reported was exaggerated or even downright fabrication. Some of this likely wasn't his fault. A lot of his gathering of information was at parties, when drunk Chimerans would tell this flamboyant stranger whatever got the most entertaining reaction. However, There were still persistent misconceptions about people and creatures of Kaimere that trace their origins to Gustav's travelogues almost 3 centuries later. He may have misinformed Assembly readers, but it must be said that he paved the way for future Assembly interactions with Chimerans by spreading tremendous goodwill throughout the known world. Prior to Dupont, most Chimerans were quite wary of humans, thinking us destructive, dull, diseased, and crude. A clean, charming, and clever yet harmless man, being the new face for humanity, did prove a boon. This goodwill likely helped academics get approval to conduct their earliest field studies, so while his work may have been a source of much-deserved derision by historians, the positive outcome of Gustav's travels are also often acknowledged. The earliest field expeditions were done entirely from vessels on which they sailed. The Great Library provided a lot of maps and charts to make their expeditions easier than going in entirely blind, but even following recommended routes, there were many dangers abound. While the many enormous beasts of Chimere's oceans accounted for some challenges, the reality is that most of these expeditions failed to reach their destination due to insufficient resources. As they were usually not permitted to make port, they had to bring what they could and hope resupply was not required. Even getting to places just beyond the known world, and places like Western Arvel, they attempted in the 1750s, proved impractical. There were some successful field missions, but it wasn't until the 1780s that these became more practical. However, practical doesn't mean that there wasn't error and confusion. From 1783 to 1791, Mary Burke, granddaughter of Margaret Thackeray, led a series of expeditions throughout Picardia with permission and guidance from a noble in the Firebird clan for a botanical and zoological survey of the lowlands. The Picardians were quite welcoming to her compared to most Chimerans, likely because several folk heroes in Picardian stories are human. Her focus was on flora, but she did give the first scientific names to a lot of Picardian animals. As the article had a botanical focus and she didn't give formal binomial names to all animals reviewed, their status was sometimes dubious. A formal review of the island's fauna, based on the Great Library Codices, was published in 1792 by Arnold Schultz, and while he used some of Burke's names, the fact that some were only published in handwritten figures meant his publications differed in spelling on some, or outright gave new names to others. It didn't help that Lance Jones did a field review with a faunal focus in 1793 and published in 1794, in which he coined many names he thought were new animals, but were just different morphs and not clearly illustrated in Burke's article, which again had more detailed focus on botany. The carakai, or common firebird, for example, was given over a dozen species epithets over several genera between the 3 researchers because domestication had resulted in a very wide range of color morphs. In 1884, the taxonomist André Durand took it upon himself to review the material and kept what names he could verify, but the carakai, for example, proved a challenge. Burke's name was earliest, but of uncertain spelling. Schultz was the next earliest, but Jones's name was in the widest circulation. To avoid favoritism or confusion, Durand assigned a new name with shared etymology to the animal's name in the Great Library texts for the genus and of Picardian for this species, which became his convention for this review. The Great Library naming system is broadly similar to binomials, though they of course don't use ancient Greek or any other human languages, unless it's for an earth animal. While the assembly tends to favor Latin and ancient Greek for scientific binomials, it is quite popular for field naturalists to use names of mythical creatures as common names or placeholders. The Permian Islands, for example, is home to animals called manticore and dragon by the assembly. In modern times, the placeholder names are much more often the name of an animal in whatever local language has the creature in its greatest abundance, but typically beyond the known world, where they do not have access to a lot of local languages, these mythical names tend to stick. Durand's work in cleaning up these early field notes was typical, but as much of the first few decades lacked a regimented structure. Missions, like Mary Burke's study, was at the whims of their hosts. Once the Assembly began conducting field missions beyond the known world in the early 1800s, they were on their own and so could practice a more consistent and regimented structure. By the 1840s, a consistent and reliable method was in practice. The first step was a quick survey from the sea to discern a good location to construct bases of operation. As they were not permitted entry in most ports, they would need stations along the way with reserves. They also had to build forts near where they planned on surveying. Usually forts were coastal, though a few were built upriver. Access by ship was imperative for their supply. Once these bases were constructed, research teams would sail from Roostercrest Island. Often these voyages took several weeks or even months. The Great Library already had vessels with steam power, and similar technology came from Earth at around this time, but neither was reliable for the distance on their own given how far these voyages were and without reliable fuel, so often used wind when it was at their backs and steam as a supplement. This hybrid model, using wind and steam, proved highly successful in its versatility, especially when aided by witches now able to freely use air or weather magic to enhance wind speed, or fire and air magic to improve the efficiency of the engine. Once a fort was constructed, typically using granite ashlar quarried in southern Kudan, a warden would be assigned for its maintenance and care. A warden might be alone, though in larger forts or those with regular use might have a small staff. A warden had formal authority over their fort. Crew of supplied vessels coming every few months might be the only other people they saw for years. Given the isolating nature of these forts, wardens were encouraged to take periodic leave. However, it was quite appealing for those who favored solitude. Their quarters were substantial and they would be afforded a great number of texts and other entertainment. A cat or dog was usually kept by a warden for company. Pay for these wardens, both the forts built or research and those constructed as reserve stations, were quite substantial, so taking on a warden post for a few years was often an appealing prospect, and at the height of field work, warden posts were surprisingly competitive. Vampires were often chosen above others, as they required much less food, could in desperate times last on their own for quite a long period of time, and often don't mind being solitary for long stretches. Now and then, a research vessel would bring a team of scholars with expertise in a range of fields and a few agents for their protection. It was rare for a team to have a singular goal. A mission might be primarily for a broad ecological survey of species or population, but a virologist, seismologist, and cartographer might come along to make their own independent studies. While the warden had authority over the fort, the team commander would have authority over the team in their study. As there were a lot of overlap in jurisdiction and neither formally ranked the other, it was important for warden and commander to be on good terms. Field work was preferred to be within a few hours of the fort, but sometimes missions would require inland work. Inland outposts couldn't count on the security and supply of coastal forts, so usually were just a quick camp. Elevated camps were built whenever possible. Many animals had never encountered humans before, so initially they were likely safe from wildlife, but it was wise to avoid acclimation. Field workers, lifeguards assigned to their defense, and wardens all benefit from weapons used in self-defense. Also, type specimens are required for publication, so naturalists often need to find either a corpse or shoot live animals. In more recent times, the Assembly has begun tranquilizing and scanning type specimens, but this technology was only recently available, so shooting animals was more common practice back at the peak of fieldwork. All this required weapons, and ideally, firearms. The Kaimerians were apprehensive but willing to allow firearms in on a small scale. After smuggled assembly muskets showed up in a few rebellions in the hands of enslaved peoples, restrictions on firearms became extremely tight. This restriction, however, was mostly on quantity and shot capacity, so the assembly invested a great deal of money in supplying their agents with firearms of the best available materials and design. The earliest guns in Kaimere were simply imported. The pistols, carbines, and muskets carried by Peter and Declan were all of conventional English make that they used in the War of Spanish Succession 20 years prior, though Peter also had an early model of the Brown Bess. The first assembly firearms were designed and produced in 1784 by James Strong, grandson of Benjamin Strong. The Strong Arms series included a pistol, carbine, and rifled musket. It was highly regarded for its durability, accuracy, and reliability compared to prior flintlocks. The Strong series was in standard use for 80 years. Some favored smoothbore muskets as they were quicker to load, but since they were weapons for hunting, most took greater pride in a slower, more accurate shot. Custom Strong rifles were purchased by several Chimeran nobles, but after a number were employed by rebels in the Free States, this practice became heavily restricted. 1829 to 1836 saw the introduction and adoption of the Crookshank series. These were percussion cap revolvers and rifles. A shotgun was also added to the series shortly after the main line debuted. Able to reliably fire under all sorts of weather and with greater accuracy than the Strong Arms, many switched to this series. Some lifeguards and wardens still favored the Strong series, but Crookshanks became standard by the 1840s. A modified breech-loading brass cartridge series came shortly after, and the double-barrel Crookshank rifle was a favorite of lifeguards by the 1860s. The next series would be circulated by the Assembly was the Burke and Wayne box locks, introduced in 1892. Though this was a full series, the Burke and Wayne Stopper was a Nitro Express big game rifle, which was the undisputed star of this series. This was a shockingly powerful rifle inspired by elephant guns and designed to take down all but the largest of Chimere's fauna. An over-under construction meant 2 shots could be fired in rapid succession, often necessary in stopping a charging animal of the size these guns were designed to handle. The standard issue were 10 and 8 bore, as the 6 and 4 could not be rifled due to the intensity of the recoil. A few vampires did commission rifled 6 and 4 bore stoppers as their enhanced strength made such guns more viable, though most field guards agree that 8 bore will do the job on almost anything Kaimere has to offer. There are some field workers who think the Burke and Wayne Stopper series has led to overconfidence. Situations in which lifeguards stayed and were killed when they should have retreated. Even though its ejectors mean that reloading can be swift, it can still take too long if both shots fail to stop the charging beasts, and animals like titanosaurs can sometimes launch a coordinated retaliation. Crookshank cartridge rifles are still in use by some agents today, as they are plenty capable of putting down most large game if the shooter is calm and their aim is true. However, the Burke and Wayne Stopper is still very popular among assembly guards and wardens. No additional firearm series were funded by the Assembly after Burke and Wayne. Between rifles used in slave rebellions and a steep reduction in approved fieldwork in the 1900s, there simply wasn't much investment, and the guns they had were perfectly serviceable for the hunting, self-defense, and specimen collection which required such weaponry. While assembly contact with peoples of Kaimere is not authorized by the oversight delegates, largely due to concern of disease spread, a gray area comes in the form of non-human sophonts. The first of these sophonts to join were the crowfolk, or Notsokidyu. Though contact was initially very limited, being only a few witches meeting assembly members in Picardia during carefully mediated exchanges, The last 2 centuries have seen several crowfolk families join the assembly in living in Agathonisis and participating in research missions. While both Manafont and Scrye have been known for centuries, and a few members partook in a few missions, it's only been in recent decades that they've joined in appreciable numbers. Several field missions have expressly sought to include members of these 3 factions, hoping to incorporate a broader range of perspective. Methods of actual field work have varied. Observation and written or illustrated records was standard operations early on. This of course came with a wide range of subjectivity. Many specimens had to be collected and preserved for verification. Photography elevated the standards and reduced the number of required specimens, meaning the assembly had less impact on the environment. It must be said that even at the height of collection, the assembly wasn't making a noteworthy impression. The abundance of Chimeran life cannot be overstated. We are, in our modern depleted global ecosystem, unable to fully comprehend what even our planet looked like a few thousand years ago. The prosperity of Kaimere is even greater. Magic in the soil and bonding to flora doesn't constitute a major aspect of trophic foundation, but it is a slight enhancement which has cascading impacts. It is difficult to assign a numeric value to how much it might enhance, since again, our depleted Earth offers a poor comparison, but it is of such magnitude that the assembly struggled to comprehend how much life is present in Kaimere. While the size of some animals certainly gained attention of these early field workers, it was the abundance and diversity which most shocked them. While fieldwork has become less frequent in the past century, it has increased in sophistication. Tracking chips and collars can greatly improve accuracy in both annual migration and short-range study. As mentioned previously, scanning specimens in the field means that there is a means of collecting very large sample sizes that both is more efficient for storage and less impactful on the local populations. Camera traps are widely used within a few miles of many outposts. While these can and do get visitation from research teams, it is often a warden who does collection and analysis to be picked up by supply ships. Ear tags and leg rings can be used to identify individuals in migration or regional studies. There aren't many protected areas in Kaimere, and very few species are considered endangered, though it must be said surveys are often quite difficult to conduct in a region, much less across a species' entire range, so some animals might be doing far better or far worse than the assembly can reasonably ascertain. While they have a lot of funding, resources, and top-of-the-line equipment at their disposal, it can be very hard to get approval the past century, so there have been a lot of gaps in knowledge. Field study will be at the heart of Wave Dancer, a story in my next anthology. In this tale, a research team has been struck with a deadly ailment, snake song. This disease is mild to Chimerans, but often lethal to humans. The Chimerans at the outpost and their vampiric warden, Henry Abernathy, are able to keep as much comfort as they can muster for their human companions, but medicine must come fast. To this end, the assembly hires Argonite, a sailor in service of Koban the Pirate King, to deliver medicine. With a Shurugen sloop and the blessing of Melrahim, Kentarine god of storm and sea, Argonite is considered the fastest sailor in the known world. Together with a few members of the assembly making the delivery, they set sail to rescue the field team before the disease takes them all. Next month will be a 5-episode series following a pair of young Zentaur, much like I did last year with the Ballad of Kahai. This series will show through their lives much of the ecology and geography of Arvel, and the many dangers that face these little monarchs long before they take their mighty throne. This series on academic institutions in Kaimere is brought to you by the generosity of my patrons. I have a lot of sponsored episodes, but this is a subject I get a lot of questions on, and I think it might be helpful insight to the people from whose perspective these videos are presented. Without my patrons over at Patreon, I know I couldn't make unsponsored series like this, so I just wanted to be sure I extended my gratitude their way. If you're interested and able, please follow the link here or down below in the description to join Patreon. Thank you all so much for watching. Cheers, folks!